That's really great. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be up here after Tom and his crew because some of you will know last year 4 of the Diversity Scholarship winners participated in an exchange we had between young people from Kenya and young people from the Co-op Housing Federation of Toronto. So it's really great to follow them. As mentioned, we're celebrating our 25th year. And while I'm speaking, there'll be a few images from our history on the big screens. They're going to go rather quickly, but all of you got our program report, and our program report has a lot of the same images. And I especially want you to pick out some of the people in them that you'll know, people involved in co-op housing in Canada. I just want to talk a bit about the history of how we got started. It's not only the 25th anniversary of Rooftops Canada, it happens to also be the 40th anniversary of my first engagement with cooperative housing. All those years ago when I was a student at McGill University, we were fortunate to begin what became, I think, the first housing cooperative in Quebec, in Montreal, the Coopérative d'Habitation de Pointe-Saint-Charles. And that was under a $200 million innovations program that I think was also being used in Toronto to get the co-op housing movement started. And our community design workshop, which was based in McGill University, then grew into the CDLC, which then grew into the CDH, which I think is the oldest Groupe de Ressources Techniques resource group in Quebec. Not long after that activity, I moved to Toronto to go to grad school and met Noreen and Mark Goldblatt in a basement of Alexandra Park, I think. For the next few years, I was lucky enough to be able to combine working with Home Starts and then the Co-op Housing Federation of Toronto with different stints in Africa, initially working with the National Housing Department in Mozambique. When I sort of came back to Canada for a bit of a stay in 1984, a group of people who shared the same passion for working on housing, not just in Canada, but in difficult overseas situations, started to meet, and out of these meetings came the idea of some kind of an organization. I think we were inspired in part by some of our other co-op housing movements, particularly in Northern Europe. And in late 1984, we set up Rooftops Canada, and it was incorporated, I think, in November of that year. Not long after, Mark Goldblatt had a very brilliant idea, and that was to try and get some core funding support from the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada to ensure that we would have at least a tiny bit of money to keep operating. And I can't remember exactly what year, I think it was 86, maybe 87, that the annual meeting passed a resolution agreeing that 3% of, at that time, the revenue of CHF Canada, which later became 3% of the membership fees of CHF Canada, would support our work overseas. And I think that's been tremendously important. It remains very important. It certainly helps us meet some of those obligations that Daryl was referring to. We have to match funding that we get from the Canadian International Development Agency. And every dollar that we get gets matched with $9 of funding from the Canadian International Development Agency. I think we started with about $700 in the bank that was donated by about 30 individuals, so we'd have a little bit of cash. Since then, we've raised over $30 million to support programs and projects with overseas partners. This has been multiplied numerous times over. I know that in South Africa alone, working with various organizations, we've mobilized about $150 million worth of housing activity. And housing costs a lot less in South Africa, so I know we've housed about 10,000 families. And many of those families are living in housing cooperatives. Not everywhere we work is it possible to develop housing co-ops, but we're committed to community-based housing run by the residents. It's not always called a housing co-op, but it always has those features. As we know from our experience here, it's not just about housing and housing units, it's about people. And it's very exciting that we have with us today, I think they were introduced earlier, 2 friends from the Zimbabwe National Association of Housing Cooperatives. And in a way, they represent the many, many organizations we've been privileged to work with over the years in 38 countries. Organizations like ours who are struggling under very tough conditions to try and help very low-income people secure land and build housing step by step. There are also many, many people in this room from across Canada that have worked with us overseas. There's always the risk of only naming a few, so the few I'm going to name are examples of the very many. Early on, we had people who went overseas as volunteers to work with our partners for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. People like Carol Davis, Karen Sexsmith, Peter Tracho, one of our very first, Stuart Thomas, who spent a lot of time in the Philippines for us. I know there are others in the room, but just a few examples. We had people who went and worked overseas, basically packed up their bags, went off to Zimbabwe. In the case of the very first housing cooperator we sent overseas, James McGregor, who isn't with us, I don't think today, but he's now vice president of the Société d'Habitation de Québec. People like Sue Moorhead, Jacques Samson, Cécile Arcan, many people that came out of our sector were willing to take the risk of working overseas. I think most of them had wonderful experiences and grew through them and really contributed to different organizations that they worked with. We're also really, really proud of the over 100 young professionals we've sent overseas in the last 10 years. And in addition to the people we send overseas, there are numerous people in Canada who contribute to what we do by supporting us here. Board members like Daryl, past president, Amanda Shaughnessy, another past president I know is in the room. Many, many of you, I'm sure, have helped by contributing your time to hosting visitors. Our friends from Zanaco, before coming here, they were hosted by FECHIM in Montreal, FECHAC in Quebec, the Confédération Québécoise des Coopératives d'Habitation, also in Quebec, CHFT, and they've been very, very generously received by all of you here during this meeting. Your sharing of experiences and also helping us to reach out to other cooperators has really made a huge difference, explaining what we do and encouraging the movement to keep supporting us. So I think together we've been able to make a really big difference. As I said, many thousands of people are enjoying a better quality of life because of our work. But there's something support of CHF Canada, of all of you, to help us try and make a small dent in that has been incredibly important. So I want to thank you all for your support and thank you very much for this award. I really appreciate it. Thanks. I just want to make one very brief announcement. Some of you know that a couple of nights ago, we do have an International Service Award of our own that we present in collaboration with CHF Canada. And this year we were very pleased. I know it's going to feel like a bit like a love-in, but to present it to Kagano Housing Co-op. And Daryl Thompson is, of course, from Kagano. So we just wanted to recognize that to all of you.
Here's the picture if you want to do another photo. Here.
This was the award. Is the award.